Welcome to episode 1 of the Beginner Woodwork series. This series aims to help you become a better woodworker and start woodworking. Today I'm going to discuss the tools that I recommend when you first start out woodworking. One of the first things you'll need to do when you start woodworking is dimension and measure lumber. For that I would recommend tape measures. Here's a small tape measure. This is a 3 meter one. I use this one quite regularly. You can also get an own brand 5 meter one like this. This is also quite good. It's very bulky and it's quite heavy. But this one's rather light and is also a 5 meter one. So this is my most commonly used one. And I would recommend getting a really good tape measure as you'll use it almost every day. Equally, I would recommend getting some sort of square. This is an engineer's square. It's quite small, but it's really handy to have. If you don't have an engineer's square, or you don't want to buy one, you can also use the 90-degree function on here, which I still use to this day. Because I currently don't have a tri-square. I will get one eventually, but the 90-degree function works well on most of the saws. A necessity when you're woodworking is a still rule, in my opinion. This is so useful. I use this every day and all the time when I'm doing woodworking. You'll be surprised how much you use it. Then of course you're going to need something that you can actually write with. My favourite's this mechanical pencil. This is quite an expensive one, so if you first start out woodworking, just get a standard pencil. A Sharpie's also quite useful, but then again you can also get a cheaper version. So that's what I would use if I'm dimensioning lumber. Now we'll move over to what I would use if I'm cutting up timber. Again, cutting is one of the things you will do so often in woodworking. Every project will require some sort of cutting up. So for sawing, I recommend getting 2 saws when you first start. A hand saw similar to this would be a good purchase. I think this was a couple of pounds. It's a very cheap one, but it's really good. This is a 500mm one, although this is my favourite one out of the 2. This is just a 350mm hand saw, and I find this really good. With the hand saws, you can't resharpen them unless you get a more expensive one, but when you first start out, you can just get a cheap one and replace it later on down the line. Now, something I would recommend if you've got the budget is a tenon saw, because this is so much more accurate than using something like this, as it has a much finer cut and works much better at cutting things. This is a fairly expensive one made by Excalibur, but you can get a lot cheaper ones. This one's really good though because it glides through the wood because it's got this special coating on it. So they're the sort of options when you're cutting up your lumber. But if you just want to get one saw that's going to be the most versatile, I'd probably go something like a 400mm hand saw or a 500mm hand saw. But I'll leave that decision up to you. If you're really interested in getting another tool to help you saw stuff, I'd recommend a coping saw. You can cut curved things with this, and this is basically the equivalent of a jigsaw in a way, because you can cut curved things with this. This is made by Eclipse, and I think it's about £10 in the UK. I really like this. It's a good tool, very versatile. So that would be my other recommendation if you're going to get something to saw. So whilst we're discussing cutting up stuff, something I really recommend you get early on in woodworking is a dust mask. So this dust mask is made by JSP and is a half mask. This is a rather expensive one, but it's your lungs you're protecting here. They keep you alive, so I would really recommend you get the best one and the most expensive one you can afford, because really this is what protects you and your lungs. So this is a half mask. This is a really good one and I really like it. It's very comfortable. I can wear it for an hour upon end, but make sure you get a dust mask when you start woodworking. Another thing I'd recommend you get is some goggles. I use these ones. These are fairly posh ones, but you don't need anything like this. You can just get the clear ones. I just like these because I work outside a lot, and when it's sunny these have the UV filters as well, so they keep out some of the sunlight. So that's what I would recommend in terms of PPE. If you do end up using power tools, obviously you'll need ear defenders, gloves you might want, but in terms of the main sort of standard PPE you need, a dust mask is a definite, as well as some goggles. So that's the kind of PPE I would recommend you get. Again, moving on to one of the most essential items in woodworking, clamps. Now, when you first start out woodworking, you don't need anything like this amount of clamps. Personally, I would get these F-style clamps. These are a cheap own brand type of clamp, but they're really good and they're cheap, so when you first start out they're great. I've got 4 of those and they're really good. I think they're 150mm and they're perfect. But if you're planning on doing a bit of a bigger project, I'd recommend you get one of these, which is a 60mm f-style clamp. These are much more versatile because they're bigger, so you can just use them on more projects. So I have 4 of those as well. When you first start out, 4 big clamps would probably suffice, and maybe 4 small clamps. Now if we move into some of the other clamps I have these pegs, which I rarely use, but occasionally they're handy if you want to glue something without too much pressure. I've got these really cheap F-style clamps, or quick clamps, whatever you want to call them, from Wilko. These are fairly good, although they don't have much clamping pressure, so I tend just to use those as another clamping force if I've already got stronger clamps on. Again, we've got spring clamps. I use these sometimes, but again, the most commonly used for me is F-style clamps. These are quite good, but they don't have as much clamping force as an F-style clamp. Moving on to some G clamps here. So I use G clamps very rarely, but when I do, I use this one most often. This is a 100mm G clamp. I do have these tiny 1-inch clamps, but these don't get used very often at all, just because they are so small, but occasionally they come in handy. I also have these 2-inch ones, which I sometimes use, and these 3-inch ones, which I do use from time to time. But when you're first starting out, you don't need G clamps, and to be honest, G clamps are more for metalworking than woodworking, and I do a tiny bit of metalworking, so from time to time it's handy to have a mix of clamps. But if you're starting out, F clamps are the way to go. So you've done the basics, you've marked out your wood and you've cut it. Now what do you do? Well, obviously you're going to want to sand your project. Now there's 2 main options when you first start sanding. One is a cork block with these pieces of sandpaper on them. This is perfectly fine, but you will be there hours and hours and very quickly get sore hands and get bored of sanding. So in my opinion, I do have one of these, but I wouldn't recommend them when you first start out. These are useful if you don't want to apply as much pressure, and you can get a lot more control than something like an electric sander. Now, if you're starting out, I'd recommend something like this. This is a detail sander made by Bosch. Tons of companies do these. You can get them really cheap, and they'll last you forever. They're great, and they're really good. So I'd recommend you get an electric sander, because they're really helpful when you're sanding stuff, and they save you so much time when you compare it to something like a cork block with a piece of sandpaper. And obviously you can get different abrasive pads. So this is a 180 grit, but you can go all the way down to about 40 grit. So that's my sander, and I recommend an electric sander. A detail sander is probably your best bet, although an orbital sander would also work. Here are 2 other tools I recommend for woodworking. They're both the same, but I just thought I would show you 2 different types. So this is a spirit level. You can see I've got a no brand one here and a branded one here. Doesn't really matter, they both do the same job. They tell you if something's flat, and this workbench is pretty much flat, which is good. So yeah, get one of these. They're helpful for when you're doing woodworking. You can tell if something's flat, and if it's not, you can fix it. So I'd recommend those, and they're also useful if you're doing general DIY and putting up shelves or something like that. So when you're first starting out woodworking, you might not have a drill. Most people tend to have a drill already. If you don't, you can get the very cheap ones, or you can get some more expensive ones. This one's made by Black & Decker and is slightly cheaper than this Makita one. I got this Makita one second hand and replaced the battery, and that's a brilliant drill. This one's also really good as well. So I would recommend getting a drill driver, because it saves you having to buy a separate impact driver and a purpose-made drill. So yeah, make sure you have a drill. It will save you a lot of time. There is the option of a hand crank drill, but to be honest, nowadays I would just go down the route of getting an electric drill. Now with the drill, you're going to want some way of drilling a hole, obviously, so you're going to need drill bits. So there's a couple of options here. So I have this set of drill bits here, and these are really good, but I would also recommend you get a bigger drill bit set, something like this, for example. So this has plenty of drill bits, and will probably have most of the drill bits you'll need for your projects. If there is a drill bit that you don't have, you can always go and buy it and add it to the collection. So as you can see, I'm missing a couple here because I use this fairly regularly, but it's got hole saws. The spade bits I've taken out and put somewhere else, but they've got masonry bits, high-speed steel bits, and brad point bits. So a standard drill set like this will come with everything you'll need to start woodworking. Now, once you've drilled your hole, there's a couple of options of how you attach the wood together. Personally, I like to use screws. And you can use a hand screwdriver, say something like this for example, but that would take a long time and you might get quite bored of it. So I use these screwdriver bits that just go in your drill, or you can get a purpose-made impact driver or an electric screwdriver. I've got a box of 25 here, I think it's about £5 or £6, and I've only used one and I've had it about 3 months, so that's what I would suggest. Or you can go down a more old-fashioned route of using nails, which isn't as common anymore, but still a purpose of attaching wood together and works perfectly well. So here's the kind of things you'll need if you're going to use nails as your fixing method. So with a screw, they tend to have a thread here, and some of them have a non-threaded part right towards the top, and you can get all different kinds of bits which you can use for these screws. So I use Dial branded screws, but it's up to you what you use. But if you're going to go down a different route, you can use nails. This is a very rusty nail, but it doesn't really matter for this purpose. So they have a head and they don't have any teeth on them. Now, there's a couple of methods for hammering in a nail. So obviously you're going to need a hammer, and there are tons and tons of hammers on the market. In my opinion, just get a versatile hammer like this. This is an all-purpose hammer. I use this for breaking up pallet wood. I use it for hammering nails in. It gets used and abused. As you can see, it's rusty. I've left it out in the rain before. They stand up to a lot of beating and they're really good. So that's what I use. You can get one of these cheaper, small style hammers. These are good, but if you're going to use bigger things and you want a larger swing, it's quite hard, and they do have a very small handle. Then you can get a wooden handle. So this has got a hickory handle on it, and I quite like this one. It's made by Silverline, which is a cheaper style tool brand, but they're perfectly good. And I recommend, if you want to get two, get one with a smaller head and one with a bigger head. To be honest, this one's lighter, so it's much easier if you're just doing something small and you don't want to have to swing it as far. And yeah, basically this one is a lot heavier, and if you're going to swing something, it's a lot heavier, as I said, so it's going to be harder on your hands. Whereas something like this, you can swing it far if you need, or you can just give a light tap down. So yeah. Last of all, there's this kind of hammer. So this has sort of like a wedge here and a hammer head here, and then this has got a nice old wooden handle. This is quite an old hammer. I restored this one, so I quite like using older style tools, but that's personal preference. And then again, when we look at a hammer, they also have this bit which is for prying the nails out, so you can basically pivot it against the hammer head here to pull a nail out. So this is quite handy actually when you're using a hammer, because they're actually a very versatile tool. But you can also use these, which are purpose made for pulling nails out. So you put these down, grab the nail, and then you can lever it against the side of the body of this tool. Then again, you also have wooden hammers. Now, I wouldn't recommend using these for nails, but if you're going to use something like, I don't know, let's have a think, a chisel or something, then a wooden mallet is what you'll need. This is one that gets used and abused, as you can see. It's very old, it's something like 10, 15 years old. So I made a new one out of Paduke, and I think this was ash. If you want to see how I made this, I'll link it up at the top. But I would recommend you also get a wooden mallet as well, if you're going to be using anything like chisels, or just something that you want to be able to hit in without damaging the surface. A wooden mallet's the way to go. So to be honest, a wooden mallet and an all-purpose hammer would be the way to go. So that's sort of your option when it comes to hammers and mallets. One other thing I'd recommend is masking tape. It's really useful because you can stick this on the wood and write all over that without actually marking the surface of the wood. So that's what I would recommend. And I would also recommend, if you want a way to enhance your woodworking projects without spending a ton of money, something like this would be really good. This is a block plane. This is made by Spear & Jackson. I've got a review and sort of unboxing video of that, so I'll link that up at the top as well. But this is essentially used for rounding over the corners of your project, but it can be used a bit wider than that, so you can use it for flattening very small bits of timber, which I have done before. But really you want a proper plane for that, so something like a jack plane would be a good idea. If you've got the budget, get something like a number 4 or number 5 plane, and also you could get a little block plane. Personally, I don't actually have a plane, I just have this block plane. I don't have a jack plane, but I will get one eventually. But for the type of woodworking I do, I actually find a block plane to be of a better use, because I round over the corners a lot. I like to create chamfers on things, so this comes in really handy. They're not particularly expensive. This one was about £20. You can get cheaper ones, and obviously you can spend hundreds of pounds on one if you really want to. So that's not a necessity, but it's something I think is quite a cool tool to have, and something that I would recommend if you want to enhance your woodworking projects. If you have any other tools that you recommend for woodworkers, put them in the comments section as it helps others out. Thanks for watching though.